Mr. Speaker, I commend this bill to the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the Honourable Member Rino Terakatane. Tēnā koe.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker. E aku rangatira o te waka o kura haupo me ki. Ngati apa ki te rātoa. Ngati Kuia. Rangitane. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Whakatau mai, whakatau mai. Whakatau mai ki te whare pāramata e takatū nei. Nō koutou tēnei rā. He rā harihari ko tēnei. Nō reira, raurangatira mahuri noa i te whare. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Mr. Speaker, I am delighted to be able to speak about these three iwi as part of this final debate today. Sir, Rangitane, Ngati Kuia and Ngati apa ki te rātoa are part of the wider collective of the iwi that we have all and will be seeing throughout the day today. And in particular, sir, they are all commonly descend from their waka, the kura haupo. And Mr. Speaker, I first want to acknowledge that in this bill, the Crown will make full apology to all of these three iwi for their past dealings and the breaches of the Crown's obligations under the Treaty of Waitangi. And all of the three iwi will receive forms of cultural, commercial and financial redress, which is consistent across the board with treaty settlements, sir. But, sir, I want to focus firstly on Ngati Kuia. Ngati Kuia has occupied the tauihu of the South Island for many, many, many generations, primarily at Kaituna, Te Hora, Te Hoere, Hangarai, Whakapuaka, Rangitoto and Whakatū. In the 1820s and 1830s, Ngati Kuia were invaded by tribes from the northern side of Cook Strait. Despite being defeated in battle, Ngati Kuia still managed to hold on to portions of their tribal estates and, more importantly, managed to maintain their chiefly identity, whakapapa and genealogical lines. More trouble was to arrive in the form of the New Zealand Company, an early colonial company, as we've heard in previous speeches, in the business of ripping off Māori from their land. Mr. Speaker, long story short, the New Zealand Company claimed to have purchased the top half of the South Island in 1839, but Ngati Kuia weren't consulted in that purchase. Rather, the invading tribes of Ngati Toa and their allies, who held sway with the company and Crown representatives. Ngati Kuia suffered because of this, sir. Even a commission of inquiry failed to recognise Ngati Kuia's mana over certain areas, and they were not allocated any shares in the Nelson tents. The 790 acres reserve at Te Hoere was insufficient for the tribe's needs, and they received a paltry £100 sterling for their whole interest in the South Island. £100 and no share in the Nelson tents. Hardly a great deal. By 1900, the Ngati Kuia were virtually landless, and they petitioned the Crown for more land, claiming they were the poorest tribe under the heavens. The Crown tried to alleviate the problem with the Landless Natives Act, and the tribe shared in a share of lands, along with other iwi and whanaunga in the South Island, to lands on Stewart Island. And not only that, sir, at the bottom of Stewart Island. But no land titles were ever issued. The Landless Native Acts caused more trouble than good. All this mamai and more, sir, the Crown will apologise for. The financial and commercial redress packages totals $24 million and includes a $12 million redress in lieu of Crown licensed forests and interest that has been accruing. Ngati Kuia will be statutorily acknowledged, sir, as having mana over certain areas of Te Tauihu. They'll also have the right of first refusal over Crown lands which may come up on offer. And so I'd like to turn to Rangitane. Once again, the transactions of the New Zealand company and their purported purchase of the top half of the South Island caused Rangitane much mamai. Like Ngati Kuia, Rangitane maintained their associations with the land and held mana in certain areas. Their chief, Ihaia Kaikoura, signed the treaty at Port Underwood, and this underlies that fact that Rangitane had their own autonomy. Rangitane also suffered the ignominy of not being recognised in the Te Tai Tapu and Nelson tents. The commission set up to investigate the South Island purchase offered Rangitane £100 to pay off their grievance. Rangitane also complained to the Crown that the land reserves set aside were insufficient for them to make any sort of economic living off them. The Crown's reaction again, sir, was the South Island Landless Natives Act, a law which caused more problems than it solved. The financial redress here, sir, recognises the economic losses suffered by Rangitane arising by the breaches of the Treaty of Waitangi by the Crown. The financial and commercial redress package totals $25 million, including $12 million redress in lieu of the Crown Forest lands and interest that has been accruing, sir. The commercial redress will allow Rangitane to have the right of first refusal for 169 years to Crown land that may become available. It will also have the right to buy and lease back Crown certain properties. And finally, sir, I want to talk to Ngati Apa. Once again, the Crown will be apologising to Ngati Apa for breaching their obligations under the Treaty of Waitangi. The Crown failed to recognise the rights of Ngati Apa in its resolution of New Zealand company transactions and its pre-1865 purchase of lands. The exclusion of Ngati Apa from the Nelson and Motueka tents and for failing to put aside enough reserved lands for Ngati Apa. An overlay classification called a tōpuni acknowledges the spiritual, cultural, historical and traditional association of Ngati Apa with certain sites of significance, such as the Alpine Tarns in the Nelson Lakes National Park. An interesting feature of the settlement is the ability to reconnect with their traditional eel fisheries at the Nelson Lakes. Also, Ngati Apa will have a right to access conservation land to fossick and take off by hand any sand, shingle or natural material from a riverbed. The financial and commercial redress, sir, $28 million, including $12 million from the Crown Forest lands. Mr. Speaker, the iwi of Ngati Kuia, Rangitane and Ngati Apa ki te rātoa suffered through the ignorance of colonial settlers and administrators who didn't give a jot of interest in these three tribes. They assumed that the mana for the top half of the Te Waiponamu lay offshore at Porirua and Kapiti Island and at Otaki. To a certain extent, that's true, but it's also true that these tribes still had their own autonomy by the time the New Zealand Company turned up in 1839. Some chiefs from these tribes even signed the Treaty of Waitangi. The taniwha amongst these tribes are the transactions of the New Zealand Company that pitted Pākehā law against Māori tikanga. It's been a generation and a half for these claims to finally come to fruition, and it's fair to say that the delay in settlement has cost lives. Some kaumātua in Kuia who started this process back in the 80s and 90s are no longer with us. I know from the Rangitane claim from the 80s, only Richard Bradley and Judith MacDonald are still with us, and it's lovely to see Richard in full health here in the House today. The same applies to the original claimants of Ngati Kuia and Ngati Apa as well, and I particularly paid mention to the late Auntie Kath Hemi, who played such a monumental role with Ngati Apa, and I acknowledge her whānau. So, sir, as we acknowledge the history and in mamai of Rangitane, Ngati Kuia and Ngati Apa, it is time for these iwi now to strike out on their own or in alliance and forge a path that will lead to a more economic and prosperous future for themselves. And I'm pleased to acknowledge my own whanaunga here from Te Runanga o Ngaitahu here, who are there, because we've got so many connections across all of the South Island, and I know that collectively working together, all the iwi and Te Waipounamu will take over the country. So, with those parting comments, sir, I mihi to the three iwi, and I wish them all the very best for the future. Kia ora no tātou katoa.
Mr. Speaker.